And as you all too well know, I can talk about fundamental knowledge that's missing and fundamental research that needs to be done, but ultimately this is all being done so that we can translate these experimental data into some sort of an intervention, whether it's preventive or curative, some new treatments. And that requires, of course, its own set of development and validation studies that will take some time. So I'd like to acknowledge people in the lab who do all the work. Vlad Kamensky is my veterinarian who does all the animal work. Serge Mostowy, my first grad student, who's now in Paris. Mazdi Bengahi, who demonstrated that NOD2 is important for mycobacterial infection. François Coulombe, who's now in Laval, who demonstrated that NOD2 is specific for mycobacterial infection. And Hafiz Jean-Daniel and Jesse are currently working on NOD2 as it pertains to autophagy. I've got collaborators at different centers, either McGill, Yale, and University of Massachusetts. My research is funded by the Canadian Genetic Disease Network, by the CIHR, and by students from McGill University Health Center. And myself, I get funding for my salary so that I get to do research full-time from McGill University and from the Fonds de la Recherche en Santé du Québec. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions, comments, criticisms, other feedback. Thank you. Yes, sir.
In your model, how would you explain the increased presence of the disease in the Northern Hemisphere and particularly in Canada?
Okay, so for people in the back of the room, the question is, why would there be an increased prevalence of the disease in the Northern Hemisphere, and particularly in Canada? So I thought about this, and I have my answer, but you can come up with alternatives. First of all, it's not really north-south so much as temperate tropical. Economou et al., if you send me an email, by the way, to there, I'll send you the article and the letter I wrote. Economou et al., IBD 2007, published a global atlas of Crohn's disease incidence. And in that atlas, the two highest countries in the world are Canada and New Zealand, suggesting it's not so much north and south, but certain areas. And what I did is I typed the 26 countries into this really complicated software program called Excel. And I compared the incidence of Crohn's in all those countries to indices of health. GDP per capita, the gross domestic product for those countries that I got from the UN, cardiovascular mortality that I got from the WHO, and tuberculosis rates that I got from the WHO. And there was a very strong inverse association between Crohn's disease and tuberculosis. That doesn't prove anything, but it was a very curious association that was much stronger than, for instance, richer countries have more Crohn's disease, or people who have more heart disease have more Crohn's disease. Those were relatively weak associations. I wanted to look at whether there's association between Crohn's disease and intestinal parasites, because that has been proposed under a model called the hygiene hypothesis. But there actually are no global data that I was able to find from the World Health Organization on hookworms and such parasites. So, so my model doesn't explain, and in fact, I didn't even answer your question. I just made a plug for a paper that I wrote, it suggests that when you have a predominant mycobacterial infection in your community, it may be protective against a different mycobacterial infection in your community. It had been proposed back in 1948 by Chaussonnel that where you have a lot of TB, you have very little leprosy, and vice versa. So that these were called the maladies antagoniques at the time, so that diseases that have cross-immunity. It may well be that Crohn's is happening where there's the least tuberculosis for some sort of immune reason that I'm not really at liberty to even propose because it's pure conjecture. But there does seem to be a non-random distribution. Your question is very valuable because when we have natural experiments in nature that tell us some places are high and some are low, we should always remember that the natural experiments are a lot more creative than the things that we come up with in the lab. Yes, a question up front.
I'm just wondering what the response among your colleagues to your article, given that you've found previous writings supported ideas, and that wasn't picked up along the way. People raised yours and said, oh, let's look at this and what we do.
So the question is, what's been the response to my article, you mean the inside-out model? There hasn't been much. I mean, I'm not a gastroenterologist. I don't go to gastroenterology rounds, so I haven't really talked to any gastroenterologists about my model. The surgeon who I deal with, who's an old school surgeon, he basically said, yeah, so what's new? I was a bit humbled, but that was good. And one gastroenterologist in Canada said he really, even if everything I said is wrong, he thought that at least the term outside in and inside out should at least go down in history for the clever terminology. You know, you put out ideas and they're of no value until you follow them up with data. So I don't expect to have much more than just people saying, and that's nice, show me something more substantial.
So you don't think they're going to follow up on that then?
The question is are they going to follow up on that?
Gastroenterologists follow up?
That's, I guess, up to them. I'm following up on it. That's up to me. But people ask me, where's my wife? I said, I don't know. You have to call her, right? I don't tell my wife when to go to work and when to come home, and I don't tell gastroenterologists what research to do or what research not to do. And we can only move forward understanding disease if all of us bring these different ideas to the table. So I'm not here to tell people where to set their research agenda. Question in the back?
Would it seems that you were saying north, south, or could it be maybe like industrialized nations more, and therefore maybe being more chemicals and nonsense entering our food chain, and maybe some of these chemicals and things that have entered our food chain are not triggering the disease?
Yeah, so the question, I guess, can I paraphrase your question just to be sure that I'm answering the right thing? You're asking whether Crohn's disease is found in industrialized countries where there could be different toxic exposures, and that the other things that are actually, like non-bacterial exposures that we're eating, or we might even be absorbing through the skin, could be contributing to these different rates of disease.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know, I'd like to be able to test that by taking the data. I still have my Excel spreadsheet, so if I was to be able to find any good quantified information on certain toxic exposures, I could enter them and say, yes, these have more or less. But these kinds of things, I think, are often very hard to measure. There's a whole world of epidemiology that tries to do air pollution studies. And to look at, what's in our food type of studies, I think may not even be as well developed as that. So I haven't looked at it. If you're aware of data for global risk of exposure to certain things, certain toxins, I'd be really happy to receive an email and see if there's any sort of an association or not.
Well, I just know from personal experience, if I have something like MSG, going to the hospital.
Yeah, but something like MSG is obviously very common in many parts of the world, right? So that there was a great vitamin A study done in Indonesia a few years ago, just asking, is vitamin A supplementation good for health? And in Indonesia, they did it by fortifying the MSG with vitamin A, just the way that we fortify salt with iodide. So that MSG isn't necessarily an exposure that's higher in one country than another. Some places in Southeast Asia may have much higher MSG exposures, and they may have lower rates of Crohn's disease than we do. So you'd have to try to quantify how much MSG are people in this room getting every day, compared to how much MSG is somebody in Vietnam getting every day, etc. And if those data exist, then it would be a simple matter to look. There's a question there.
Have there been any positive results shown for Crohn's disease patients being treated for mycobacterial infection?
Yeah, so there's been a number of small series, and often they were uncontrolled. And as you probably all are aware, the disease kind of comes and goes in unpredictable ways. So just because you took antibiotics and got better, you can't really say it got better because of the antibiotics. So the best way to establish it is to do randomized controlled trials with the placebo group and an antibiotic group.